ask for the reading now. We're going to have a reading from Luke's Gospel, which we're going to be thinking about over the next few weeks. And after that, we've got a little video before I start to talk to you.
The reading is from Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled and handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seems good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught.
Well, I used to work in the VAT office many years ago, which wasn't the most exciting place to work at, but there were some really nice people there, and people knew I was a Christian. I had opportunity to chat with them, and they knew I went off to the Christian Union, and they were genuinely interested. But I remember one day I was having a conversation with two people, and they were both like extremely intelligent people, much more intelligent than me, and they had lots of really intelligent questions, and it was kind of hard going, but in a positive way. They weren't out to catch me out, but they just had all sorts of questions. Why are there 4 Gospels? And how do you know Jesus exists? And question after question after question after question. And we realised, actually, we ought to do a bit of work, actually. We did used to work in the VAT office sometimes. But at the end of it, one of the guys, Ian his name was, he said, well, I suppose it all comes down to faith, really, doesn't it? Now, what would you have expected me to say? Now, you probably would expect me to say, well, yes, it does, but I didn't. I said, it doesn't, actually. And he said, pardon? What do you mean? I said, actually, no, it doesn't come down to faith, not first and foremost. For me, this is what it comes down to. I know, I am sure, I've looked at the Gospels. I've read what Jesus has said. I've found out that Jesus existed. I've looked at it really carefully. And I'm absolutely sure that Jesus is who he said he is and did what he came to do, that he is the Son of God who came to this world, that he died for my sins and rose again. And it's because of that I have faith, because I'm sure about these things. Now, we're starting a new series called Investigating Jesus. And over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be thinking really about 2 things: how we follow, why we follow. And today, really, we're kind of hovering over that second one. Why follow Jesus? What's it all about? And throughout this series, we're going to be thinking about the account of Jesus written by a man called Luke. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. We're going to see that we can trust this account of Jesus. And that if we can trust it, well, it's game on for faith. It's life-changing. So between now and Easter, we're going to investigate the claims that Luke made about Jesus way back in the 1st century and see what they mean to us in the 21st century. Now, before we go any further, I want to make a bit of an apology to those of you who aren't Jesus followers, an apology on behalf of the church. Not this church, but generally the church. See, throughout the years, when people have come with questions, we've tended to do this. We've tended to say, well, we know because the Bible tells us so. You know, remember, those of us who are old enough remember a song, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Yeah, and the Bible does tell me Jesus loves me, but actually, do you know, I think that's actually quite an unhelpful phrase, especially if someone's not a person of faith and wants to find out more. Because as we'll see as we go on, it's coming at faith from the wrong direction. Yeah, we don't say you've got to believe this because it says that. So, but if you're not a Jesus follower, you might be thinking, yeah, I've heard people say you must believe because the Bible tells me so. So are you telling me that I need to believe on the basis of a collection of literature written by dozens and dozens of people over hundreds of years that I need to believe in Jesus and know him as you do? Maybe also you're a Jesus follower and you've actually been struggling with faith. You know, it's okay to struggle with faith. We ought to have these things like, not exactly Agnostics Anonymous, but sometimes, we get together and talk about struggles we have because we live in a skeptical age, and there's all sorts of stuff coming out from the internet, and misinformation on YouTube and that kind of thing. And actually that can throw us off course. And you've been struggling and you've gone to Christians and what have they done? They say, well, you've got to believe. It's in the Bible. It's in the Bible. The Bible tells us so. And you might be near the exit door because of that. You see, I think we get the whole thing the wrong way round. The foundation of our faith is far more substantial than that. And as we're going to see in this series, it's investigatable. Oh, I've got that word right. I've been practicing that all week. So what I'm going to invite you to do in this series is to ask the hard questions with us. It's okay to ask the hard questions. We haven't always got the answers. Alpha is all about asking the hard questions, and Colin's much better at answering them than me, but it's important to ask those hard questions. It's important for us, who are people of faith, to listen to those questions. Because the Christian faith isn't a blind leap of faith. You see, that's why those people said to me, well, it comes down to faith. They were really saying, you're just taking a blind leap into the unknown. Nothing of the sort. But it rests on the testimony of one single person. It doesn't rest on us saying, yeah, the Bible says it and I believe it. It rests on something else. It rests on a person, not on a collection of books that you find in the Bible. It rests on Jesus of Nazareth. And we find out about him through the writings of 4 people: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of course, you may be aware that we call those books the Gospels. It means the good news of Jesus. 4 accounts of the life and the message of Jesus. It all started with an event. Jesus rose from the dead. And immediately following that, there was a movement. The interesting thing is that movement wasn't initially called Christianity. People say Christianity's been around for centuries and centuries and centuries. It has, but initially they were just known as Jesus followers, disciples of Jesus. In fact, they were nicknamed the Way because they were saying, Jesus said, I am the way, and we're following him. It was a little bit later on, as Jesus' early followers spread the good news of him and more people came to Jesus. They said, hey, these people, they're totally centered on Jesus. And they say he is the Christ, so they called them Christians. People who are like Christ, who want to follow Christ. So these people who were involved in this movement gathered in local groups. Local groups like this one, local groups that became known as churches. And that's where we get Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, which was the second book that Luke wrote about how the good news of Jesus spread. So this all happened in the first century, probably before 70 AD. It was all going on. This goes right back to the roots. And the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were recording what they saw, experienced, and what other people around them experienced. And as we're going to see later, the Bible as we know it came together later at that time. It all started with a person, Jesus, the event, his resurrection, a movement, people who were following him and were recording the facts about the life of Jesus so other people could know about Jesus. What I want to get across is this. The narrative of Jesus, the story of Jesus, isn't just a story in the Bible. You know, that's another song we used to sing. I must seem like I'm historic when I say these things, but some of you remember, tell me the stories of Jesus long, long ago. You know, and all those kind of, I hated those songs actually. I really didn't like, I still don't like them now. Tell me the stories of Jesus. And actually, it's not about a collection of stories. It's about a life that changed the world. Jesus is the reason there is a Bible. So for the next few weeks, we're going to explore one account of Jesus' life, which was written by Luke. Now, I said I'd tell you a bit more about Luke, and this is a bit of background. Luke was a doctor. He's called the beloved physician. And as you know, doctors are really methodical. You know, they need to get to the facts. Now, we've had an interesting week this week. Hazel had an argument with the cinema door down there, at the cinema there, and so we've been in A&E twice this week, seen quite a few doctors. Very impressive doctors. Long wait, but once you see them, very impressive. And they don't just give you a little look and say, oh, yeah, right, we'll stick a plaster on that and go home, but they ask all sorts of questions, you know, and they say, can you move your finger? You know, oh, does that hurt? Does that hurt? Does that hurt? Does that hurt? Ouch! I think they're looking for ways to hurt you, but very, very methodical. They've got their questions. They need to come to their decision. This was Luke, you know. He wasn't just going, you know, for the first thing he saw. No, he was very methodical. And he knew Jesus' disciples. He wasn't actually Luke, one of the 12 of the disciples of Jesus. He came to Jesus after the resurrection, and he traveled. He traveled with the disciples. And he wrote an account of that in another book we call Acts, where he traveled with Paul and wrote about the way the good news of Jesus was spreading. And of course, during that time, he would have talked to people like Peter. He would have met eyewitnesses. So this is how he introduces his account of Jesus' life. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Many. I wonder how many people would draw up an account of your life or my life. Not many. I don't know anyone who would draw up an account of my life. Actually, in history, not many people undertook to draw an account of anyone in those days. I know we have lots of biographies nowadays, but not in those days. You can put together pieces of, say, you know, Tiberius Caesar, one of the people who ruled the Roman Empire, just a bit. Well, there's virtually nothing written about Pilate apart from what's in the New Testament, really, and a Jewish historian, Josephus, told us about. Do you know how many detailed accounts there are of a life of any ancient peasant, crucified criminals, or famous first-century rabbis? Absolutely none. We have quotes and stories that we can piece together about these people, but it's nothing close to what Luke presents about the life of Jesus. So why did Luke bother to bring us a detailed account of a Galilean laborer turned rabbi who was executed by the Romans? Why was that a story worth telling? And why would others want to tell that story as well? Why so many? Well, there can only be one reason. Something extraordinary happened. It was something that had implications for further generations, for us who are here this morning. It wasn't just extraordinary. Something good had happened for people in the world. Something that would change the world and change the future. And someone had to tell it. And that person is Luke. Many have undertaken to draw an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, he said. I find that interesting. He says us. He's talking as one of the people who've been affected by it. And that's because it happened in his lifetime. And he was with people whose lives have been changed by Jesus. He was with Peter, who'd been with Jesus at the resurrection, who'd met with him. Luke knew men and women who played key roles in developing this extraordinary story and telling it across the world. Look at the way he goes on to talk about it. Just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, that meant they had nothing to gain themselves. They actually just wanted to spread that message. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated They were eyewitnesses. And Luke says that he carefully investigated about this. And the word used there means that he followed closely. He paid close attention. He looked at it. He looked at it intensely. You know, when you really got to piece things together. Actually, when I worked in the VAT, there was an investigation division, and you had to sort of look at someone's accounts, and you had to piece them together, and you have to get background information to work out, why their VAT accounts were in that kind of state, and what lay behind it, and what needed to be doing. That's the meaning of the word that Luke uses there. These were eyewitnesses. I've put all this together. It's not haphazard. It's been careful. Everything from the beginning. That's why Luke begins the story of Jesus and John the Baptist right from the beginning, right from when they were born. He says, I too decided to write an orderly account for you. I really knew I needed to do this. This is the point. This is the point I've been trying to make. Luke didn't sit down and think, I think I'm going to write a piece for the Bible. Sometimes you might think, I think I might write a piece for the local paper. I wouldn't bother, it's a rubbish paper. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But Luke didn't sit down and think, I think I might write for the Bible. No, he didn't do that at all. He sat down, and I'm sure, moved by God, by the Holy Spirit, he sat down and thought, I need to document the life of Jesus so it can be used, so it can help people be grounded in their faith, and they know their faith is rooted in a real historic person who we met. He's documenting the events that happened in his lifetime. He's describing the life and the teachings of Jesus. We don't take Luke's account seriously just because it's in the Bible. Actually, do you know what? Luke's account was written 300 years before the Bible was actually brought together. The literature was out there, all the older things, the prophets have said, there were all the letters that Paul wrote to the churches that God gave to them, but they weren't brought together as the Bible at that point. It was 300 years later that happened. Luke's account didn't become reliable when it was included in the Bible. It was included in the Bible because it was reliable. Now, let me give you an illustration to help you see that. When you go to a hotel or an Airbnb or something, and there's a safe, and you've got valuables. What do you do with the valuables? Well, you put them in the safe. The challenging thing for me is to remember that they're in there. I've been on, I used to work a lot on these Christian trips as a speaker, but I remember being on one trip, and the driver got to the border, and he went to get his passport out, and where was it? In the hotel safe. But you put your passport in the hotel safe because it's valuable, because it's important. Luke's gospel was put in the Bible because it was valuable. It was already considered valuable. So if you're struggling with faith or considering following Jesus, or just even a little bit curious, you might be asking, can I trust this? Is Luke lying? Because when all's said and done, he can't be mistaken. He either carefully investigated everything from the beginning, as he says, or he didn't. If he did, there's no reason or evidence to think otherwise. We should lean into Luke. It's game on for faith. This is a grounding in our faith. This is clear and certain. All the stuff that people believe out there. This is what really amazes me. People believe, the stars can control you, and they believe, in some guardian angel that watches over them, or all this kind of airy-fairy stuff. This is clear and certain. Sometimes I think, why can't you just see? Well, I don't say that to them. I just pray that, Lord, why can't people just see that? It's game on for faith. We should lean into it because Luke's convinced with what he's writing to us that it matters to us. He believes his account. He knows it's true. He claims that what actually follows happened. He's either telling us the truth or he's not. And he said, I carefully investigated it. And it's borne out by those other gospels, those other pieces of literature, and by history that tells us about Jesus who came. His account is based on conversations with people who were there with Jesus at the time. His account is based on his knowledge that something extraordinary happened. Something that's good for you, for your family, for the world. Well, to find out how good it is, let's look on to what he says. I decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. I can't say it as well as you did, Gene. Theophilus, well, that's a grand name. Now, we don't know much about this man. I say this man and not his name. He's obviously someone very important because he calls him most excellent philosopher. Most excellent. He calls him the most excellent. So he obviously was, influential, probably wealthy, a new believer. And Luke wants to ground him in his faith. I've written this for you so that you might know the certainty of the things you have been taught. You see what he's saying there? He's saying to this man, look, I don't want you to take a blind leap of faith. I want you to know that we are certain of these things. Christianity, following Jesus, is one of the most certain things you can do compared to anything else that's kind of on the religious market out there. This is certain. This is borne out by eyewitnesses. I want you to have your relationship with him grounded. See, he didn't want to leave this person, whose name I'm not going to say again, and anyone else left with the impression that Christianity is about taking a blind leap of faith. If anyone tells you that, that is wrong. It is not. Luke wants us to know that our faith is rooted in an event. The resurrection of Jesus that launched the movement. People's lives turned upside down, telling people the good news of Jesus, leading people to him. And now, as I said, I think we can be pretty sure that Luke didn't wake up one morning and think, yeah, I'm going to write a gospel. No, he said, I'm going to put together this account of Jesus because God's moved me so that I can ground this man and others in their faith. But I can tell you how we came to know it as Luke's gospel. So bear with me. We're going to take a bit of a light speed tour about this. So Luke's document, when it was finished, was meticulously copied. There were no printing presses. He couldn't put it through the photocopier. People copied it out by hand, and there's evidence of all these documents that were around at that time. And then it was distributed to gatherings of Christians. And some of them even memorized it. People memorized a lot in those days because they couldn't look at their phones. They didn't have the kind of prompts that we had. Their memories were actually much better. And then, of course, it was opposed. You can read that. Yet Christianity was considered subversive by the people who ruled, by the Romans, because they were saying, we have a king, he's Jesus, and we're following him. And of course, the Roman authorities didn't like that. And as the church grew, that opposition became more intense. And later on, there was an emperor. His name was Diocletian. And he realized the only way you could get rid of Christians was to get rid of their literature. He thought, I'll starve that flow of literature, because he knew it was based on facts. He knew it was based on these facts that people like Luke were putting out. So we had all Christian literature gathered up and destroyed. He tried to, but he just couldn't. It just kept coming and coming and coming and coming and coming. The more he tried to stop it, the more it carried on. But then, by the beginning of the 4th century, there was a game changer. The emperor called Constantine allowed Christians to worship publicly and get their literature out into the open. And so thousands of these manuscripts of Luke and of Matthew, Mark and John were put together and compared and authorized, and all the letters that were written by people like Paul that God had given, and the account that Luke gave of the early church, they were brought together and put in the very first Bible. So you see, the stories of Jesus aren't in the Bible. Jesus is the story of the Bible. Jesus is at the core of the Bible. He is the reason that we have a Bible. I know you might say, well, what about all those prophets of long ago? Yeah, there were the scrolls of the prophets that were circulated among the Jewish people, but never before were they brought together in this one book of what preceded Jesus, how Jesus came and how we live for him. Jesus is the reason for that. And at the end of all those 4 Gospels, we're told that Jesus was crucified, buried, and risen from the dead. When Jesus rose from the dead, something happened to the world. Something that changed the world forever. Something that changes the future, that gives us hope. And that's the reason why we're here this morning. It all comes down to the Gospels, to the good news of Jesus. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy called Tom Holland. Oh, sorry, wrong Tom Holland, that is. Yeah, not Spider-Man. Really fascinating guy. I listened to a podcast the other day. I listened to this podcast called The Rest is Politics with Rory Stewart and Alistair Graham. Not Alistair Graham, Alistair somewhere. What's his name? Alistair Campbell, that's it. Fascinating podcast. I really enjoy listening to it. They're both either agnostics or atheists because they often talk about, the days when Alistair Campbell worked with Tony Blair and he said, we don't do God. Alistair Campbell always says, we don't do God. But they had Tom Holland on there. Now, Tom Holland, fascinating man. He actually was brought up as a Christian, but sort of went away from it. And he decided, actually, he was just going to study history. And he's a brilliant historian. He has a podcast called The Rest is History, best-selling books. But actually, the more he studied history, the more he realized actually that the important things that we have, the values, of equality and justice and dignity, they all come from the teachings of Jesus. They were all brought to us by Christians. And he said something amazing. I recommend anything that he puts out. But he said, we are all children of the Christian Revolution. See, what he's saying is, what we see in Luke there, changed the world for good because it's Jesus. He's the story. So as we wrap up this first installment of the series, I want to leave you with this, especially if you're not a Jesus follower. If you choose not to follow Jesus because it's inconvenient, I get that. I'm not encouraging you to, because I get that. I get that if you say, well, look, there's a cost to it. It means I might have to give up a relationship that's not good that I'm not in. It means I might have to own up to something. It means I'm going to have to give up some things and I'm going to have to live for Jesus and face the opposition I'll get. I get that. Following Jesus requires something from you and of you. It requires you to be less selfish and more forgiving. It may cost you time, money, or even relationships. But if you decide to follow Jesus, it will make your life better and you better at life. Won't always be convenient. But I hope you don't refuse to follow Jesus because it's inconvenient. I understand if you don't. I hope you don't. But I do get it because I was like that too. I held out for ages. I remember being in a meeting when I was a teenager and hearing someone talk about Jesus and knowing actually I needed to come to Jesus, but thinking, I don't want to come. I don't want to give this up. I don't want to give that up. I don't. My friends laughing at me. I get that, but I don't encourage it. But if you don't choose to follow Jesus because you don't think there's anything to the story of Jesus, well, that's another kettle of fish. Don't give up on following Jesus until you've investigated who he was, what he said, and what that means to your life. Stick with us for the next few weeks as we look at Luke's investigation. And Jesus followers. Here's something I want you to take away today. I want you to recenter your faith. What do I mean? Let me give you an example. Imagine you're taking a photo. You're taking a photo of a loved one, your grandchild, or your son, or your daughter, or your wife, or your husband. And instead of being in the middle of the photo, somehow they're at the side. And you can see, sheep and hills and other things, all quite a good part of the photos, but they're at the side. Yeah, our lives can be like that. That actually Jesus is there, but he's not at the center. We want the joy, we want the forgiveness, we want the fulfillment and the sense of purpose, but somehow Jesus isn't at the center, and we kind of need to recenter. Like we move that camera so the person is at the middle and everything's in perspective. And we can get things out of perspective, can't we? Yeah, I tell you, I have found this really helpful preparing this week. Because, we've had a bit of a difficult... I mean, it's not me that's broken my arm, but I tell you, sitting in A&E for, I think it must have been 10 hours, you despair of ever getting out. At one point I was thinking, have I always been in A&E? I can't remember a life outside of here, It was it's bizarre sort of experience, isn't it? And I even got to the point where I tried to stretch out on metal chairs to sleep. I managed it as well. I must have been totally worn out. But I tell you, I was thinking through these things, and what I realized was actually Jesus isn't part of my story. Jesus doesn't fit into my life neatly. It's not about me. I fit into his stories. And the trouble is sometimes, as Christians, all we talk about is ourselves, isn't it? I'm having a hard time. I'm having a difficult time. I'm depressed. And yeah, you might have these things, but actually, first of all, recenter. Put Jesus at the center. I'm part of his story. I belong to him. That would change everything. The center of your faith isn't purpose, joy, or forgiveness. And, if our faith gets shaken when things go bad, actually, it's not a good sign that we're not quite in kilter there. Because our faith is in Jesus, who had his life turned upside down, who was taken to the cross, who died but rose again. It's about God's Son, who lived among us, died on the cross, rose and started a new movement that changed the world. And when you recenter your faith, you'll discover that. You'll discover that new perspective. So if you read Luke's gospel and also the book of Acts that follows that talks about how the message spread, you'll see that something extraordinary happened all those years ago in the first century. Something that has relevance to us here in the 21st century. The story had to be told. And Luke was one of the people who told it. And we're going to pick up more on that account next week as we carry on investigating Jesus.